Hey folks, tonight we're going somewhere dark, damp, and absolutely awful. The medieval jail cell. You know, that charming little stone box where people ended up for crimes like stealing bread or just looking suspicious. Getting arrested in the Middle Ages wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a one-way trip into rot, rats, and regret. No rights, no trial, no idea what you did wrong, just shackles and silence. So before we crawl into this historical horror story, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy this weird, sleepy corner of the internet. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is. I always love seeing who's joining me for these late-night misadventures. Now dim the lights, maybe wrap yourself in a blanket, and let's quietly imagine what it felt like to be locked up and forgotten. So, let's say you've just been arrested. Maybe you bumped into the wrong noble. Maybe you wore the wrong color on a holy day. Maybe someone important just didn't like your face. Doesn't matter. You're now officially a problem. And medieval society didn't solve problems. It buried them. Literally, if necessary. There were no lawyers waiting to argue your innocence. No Miranda rights. No one asked if you'd like to make a phone call, mostly because phones wouldn't be invented for another 600 years. But even if they had been, you wouldn't have been allowed to use one, because you weren't a citizen. You weren't a person in the modern legal sense. You were an inconvenience that needed to be dealt with. And fast. The moment you were arrested, your status changed. You went from member of the village to walking guilt. You didn't get to speak. You didn't get to defend yourself. You didn't even get told what you'd done wrong most of the time. Sometimes, they'd just lock you up and say, "We'll figure it out later." And by figure it out, they usually meant torture. There were no official charges, no paperwork, no process. A lord could point a finger and say, "Him." A priest could claim you were possessed. A guard could arrest you just to meet their quota, if quotas had existed, which they didn't, but egos did, and grudges, lots of grudges. In short, if someone with power thought you were guilty, then you were. And if they thought you weren't guilty, well, you still might be useful as an example. No one asked how you were doing. No one said, "We'll get this cleared up soon." What you got was silence, a cold floor, and maybe a wet piece of bread if someone in the kitchen liked your face. And if you dared to speak up, to ask why you were there, or insist on your innocence, that was a great way to be labelled uncooperative, which, in the Middle Ages, was often just one step above witch. So yes, once you were arrested, you didn't just lose your freedom. You lost your identity, your dignity, your right to exist outside the walls of a cell. And in many cases, you didn't get those things back, even if you were innocent, even if no one remembered why you were there in the first place. Because in the medieval world, justice wasn't blind. It was just busy and didn't have time for people like you. By now, you might be wondering, what exactly did I do to end up in here? Good question. Excellent question, actually. Unfortunately, no one's going to answer it. Because in the Middle Ages, you didn't need to break a law to be arrested. Just existing under the wrong circumstances could do the trick. Sometimes, it was something as simple as your clothes. If they were too ragged, you looked like a vagrant. If they were too nice, you looked like a thief. Either way, someone would frown, whisper to a guard, and boom, off to the dungeon you go. Other times, it was your face. Maybe you had a strange accent. Maybe your eyes were a little too squinty. Maybe you were just new in town. The locals didn't need a reason. They just needed suspicion. And in a time when disease, hunger, and mysterious goat deaths were common, someone always had to take the blame. Let's say the baker's daughter suddenly falls ill. There's no doctor, no science, no understanding of bacteria. But you, the traveller who passed through yesterday with weird herbs in your pocket, you must have cursed her, arrested. Or maybe the village priest has a bad dream. He wakes up convinced someone is harbouring dark spirits. He looks outside, sees you, still half asleep and yawning, arrested. Sometimes it was even less dramatic. Someone simply needed a scapegoat. A nobleman's prized chicken goes missing. A merchant's wine cart flips over. You were standing nearby. That's enough. The truth is, laws weren't laws as we know them. There were no neat little books with numbered statutes. There were customs, hearsay, and the mood of whoever was in charge that day. A law could be created on the spot. Today, it's legal to whistle. Tomorrow, it's not, and you're guilty for not knowing. Even when there was a crime, theft, say, the punishment had nothing to do with scale. Steal a loaf of bread, lose a hand. Steal a horse, lose a hand. Look at someone's horse the wrong way? You guessed it, lose a hand. The justice system wasn't about fairness. It was about control, about keeping people afraid and obedient. And it worked, because no one knew what might get them punished next. There was no consistency, no logic, just whispers, rumors, and really bad luck. So next time you imagine living in a medieval town, ask yourself, what if someone pointed at you and said, "That one looks suspicious"? Because in that world, that was enough. And just like that, your new address was the dungeon. So, let's say you didn't commit a crime. That's fine. No one else really did either. But surely someone official would need to arrest you, right? Like a judge? A sheriff? Someone with a shiny badge? Nope. In the medieval world, authority was more of a vibe than a job title. If someone had power, any power, they could decide you looked like trouble, and that was that. The town guard? Sure, that's expected. But also, the blacksmith's cousin who sometimes helps with tax collection, the local priest on a holy mood swing, the mayor's son who failed out of night school, even the tavern owner's brother, if he was having a bad week and thought you insulted his dog. The truth is, due process wasn't a thing. Neither was chain of command. If someone outranked you, socially, financially, or just by yelling louder, they could order your arrest. No warrant, no hearing, no real explanation. Let's say a minor noble is riding through town, and his horse gets spooked. He falls, ruins his fancy boots, and someone has to pay. Guess who? You. You were standing nearby. That's suspicious enough. Or maybe the bishop hears that someone was mocking the church bells last Sunday. Did anyone see who? Number? But you weren't at mass, were you? That's odd. Very odd. Into the dungeon. Even landlords could accuse their tenants of suspicious behavior just to settle a rent dispute. Can't pay this month? Must be because you're too busy practicing witchcraft. In theory, there were people higher up, dukes, councils, kings, but those folks didn't care about your situation. Most of the time, they didn't even know your village existed. Local justice was just that. Local, which meant arbitrary, emotional, and deeply personal. And don't expect to argue your way out of it. Raising your voice could be seen as defiance. Asking questions might look like sorcery. Even looking someone in the eye could be interpreted as insolence, especially if that someone hadn't blinked since Tuesday. Once again, it didn't matter if you were innocent. You were convenient. So imagine walking through town, minding your own business, when someone important decides you seem off. That's it, that's all it takes. Next stop, a stone room, a wooden door, and a lot of rats that don't respect personal space. In the Middle Ages, justice wasn't blind, it just wasn't paying attention, and anyone with a scrap of power could decide your fate with a single sentence. Take him. By now you've been accused of something vague. Someone important didn't like your face. And just like that, you're arrested. Surely, now it's time for the investigation, right? You know, to prove what really happened? Not exactly. In the Middle Ages, the idea of investigate first, arrest later wasn't popular. In fact, it didn't exist. What did exist was the opposite. Arrest first, figure it out eventually, or not at all. The assumption was simple. If someone decided to arrest you, you must have done something. And if not, well, maybe you'll confess to something else while they're at it. This wasn't about guilt or evidence. This was about removing you from the streets, from the public eye, from the conversation. You became a non-person, tucked safely behind stone walls where no one had to think about you anymore. The goal wasn't to find the truth. The goal was to keep order. And you, walking around suspiciously, existing without permission, you were disorder. Let's say someone was murdered in the market. No witnesses, no leads. But you just arrived in town last week, and you don't talk much. That's weird. Weird equals guilty. Arrested. Or maybe the grain stores are mysteriously short this season. The baker blames the miller. The miller blames the rats, but the local constable blames you because you're new, quiet, and probably cursed. Arrested. Even the word trial is generous. There were no defense lawyers, no investigation teams, no impartial juries. There might be a priest, there might be a noble, or maybe just some guy named Walter who heard a rumor and feels strongly about it. Evidence? Optional. A rumor, a glare, or a particularly enthusiastic accusation was often enough. You didn't get your day in court. You got a bad afternoon in chains and someone yelling in Latin. And here's the best part. If no one came to your defense, which was most of the time, then there was no follow-up. You simply stayed in jail. Not because you were convicted, but because no one bothered to unconvict you. Eventually, someone might say, "We should probably decide what to do with that guy in cell 3. And by then, you'd either be dead from sickness, or you'd confess to stealing something you didn't even know existed, like the mayor's ceremonial goat spoon. It wasn't about justice, it was about closure. And if you didn't give them a neat ending to their story, they'd just write one for you. So no, you didn't get questioned first. You got arrested, forgotten, and maybe, if someone had the time, blamed later. Welcome to medieval law and order. You're guilty until convenient. By now, you've been accused of something vague. Someone important didn't like your face. And just like that, you're arrested. Surely, now it's time for the investigation, right? You know, to prove what really happened? Not exactly. In the Middle Ages, the idea of investigate first, arrest later wasn't popular. In fact, it didn't exist. What did exist was the opposite. Arrest first, figure it out eventually, or not at all. The assumption was simple. If someone decided to arrest you, you must have done something. And if not, well, maybe you'll confess to something else while they're at it. This wasn't about guilt or evidence. This was about removing you from the streets, from the public eye, from the conversation. You became a non-person, tucked safely behind stone walls where no one had to think about you anymore. The goal wasn't to find the truth. The goal was to keep order. And you, walking around suspiciously, existing without permission, you were disorder. Let's say someone was murdered in the market. No witnesses, no leads. But you just arrived in town last week, and you don't talk much. That's weird. Weird equals guilty. Arrested. Or maybe the grain stores are mysteriously short this season. The baker blames the miller blames the rats. But the local constable blames you because you're new, quiet, and probably cursed. Arrested. Even the word trial is generous. There were no defense lawyers, no investigation teams, no impartial juries. There might be a priest, there might be a noble, or maybe just some guy named Walter who heard a rumor and feels strongly about it. Evidence? Optional. A rumor, a glare, or a particularly enthusiastic accusation was often enough. You didn't get your day in court. You got a bad afternoon in chains and someone yelling in Latin. And here's the best part. If no one came to your defense, which was most of the time, then there was no follow-up. You simply stayed in jail. Not because you were convicted, but because no one bothered to unconvict you. Eventually, someone might say, "We should probably decide what to do with that guy in cell 3. And by then, you'd either be dead from sickness, or you'd confess to stealing something you didn't even know existed, like the mayor's ceremonial goat spoon. It wasn't about justice, it was about closure. And if you didn't give them a neat ending to their story, they'd just write one for you. So no, you didn't get questioned first. You got arrested, forgotten, and maybe, if someone had the time, blamed later. Welcome to medieval law and order. You're guilty until convenient. If you thought being in the dungeon was the worst part, oh no. That was just the waiting room. The real horror was the equipment. Because in the Middle Ages, torture wasn't just accepted, it was practically an art form. Not an art you'd want to hang on a wall, of course, but still, someone put thought into it. Let's start with the basics. The rack, of course, everyone's favorite. Lie down, get tied at both ends, and then stretch, just a little, then a little more, until your joints started whispering goodbye. Not exciting enough? Try the thumb screws. A compact little tool that squeezed your fingers until they forgot they were fingers. It didn't take long before, "I swear I'm innocent," turned into, "Fine, I stole the Archbishop's socks." Then we have the iron boot. Pop your leg inside, add some wedges, and hammer them in, over and over. The result? You'd confess to anything. Things you didn't do, things you couldn't have done, things that hadn't been invented yet. But the creativity didn't stop there. Enter the pair of anguish, a metal device inserted into, let's say, uncomfortable places, then turned, slowly, widely. Its existence alone was often enough to get people talking. Still too mild? Let's escalate. How about the Catherine wheel? A giant spoked wheel where your limbs were tied and broken one by one, rhythmically, like a very grim percussion instrument. Sometimes they left you on display afterward, like medieval art with a heartbeat. Or the scavenger's daughter, a charming device that folded your body inward, spine, ribs, organs, all politely asking for more room. No one left that contraption taller than they entered. And then, the goat. Yes, a real goat. You'd have salt rubbed on your feet. Then they'd bring in the goat to lick it off. At first, it tickled. But goats have rough tongues, and they don't stop. Eventually, skin wears away, then flesh, then, well, you talk long before the bone shows up. Because these devices weren't random. They were deliberately designed to be slow, strange, and psychologically devastating. Why? Because unpredictability breeds fear, and fear makes people speak. So, when we say, medieval justice was creative, what we really mean is, someone spent a lot of time inventing ways to make you wish you'd never been born. And worst of all, most of these devices didn't even have names when you saw them, just shapes in the shadows, waiting. So, you've made it this far. You've been arrested without a reason, interrogated without a question, and introduced to a collection of torture devices that sound like rejected kitchen tools. But even when they weren't actively hurting you, the dungeon itself did the job just fine. Because medieval prisons weren't designed to hold people. They were designed to break them, slowly, silently, and thoroughly. Let's set the scene. First, the air. Stale, wet, thick with the smell of rot and rust and things that had once been alive but very much weren't anymore. No windows, just stone, sweating stone, and one tiny vent that didn't so much bring in fresh air as share its disappointment. Now, the light, or lack of it. A single torch, maybe, if you were lucky. Most of the time, it was complete darkness, the kind of dark where you couldn't see your own hands, and your imagination became a much louder roommate. Then, the floor. Not level, not dry. You sat in water, or something that used to be water. Sometimes it moved, sometimes it squeaked. Definitely not a place to lie down unless you were feeling adventurous or hopeless. Now, the company. You weren't alone. There were rats, the kind that didn't run when they saw you. They stared. There were bugs, spiders, maybe a snake or two, depending on local architecture. And there were people, 10 or more crammed into a space meant for 3. Some moaned, some mumbled, some stared into nothing like they'd already left their bodies behind. And you all shared the same corner bucket, for everything. Food? If someone remembered, you might get bread hard enough to injure someone with. Water? Often shared from the same tin bowl that was also used for other things. Noise? Surprisingly loud. Chains clinking, rats chewing, people crying. But also, terrifyingly silent when someone stopped making noise. Because that usually meant they wouldn't start again. And time melted. There were no clocks, no sunrise, no Monday. Just days that blurred into each other, broken only by footsteps that meant someone was coming for someone. In short, the dungeon wasn't where you served time. It was where you lost track of it, and slowly, of yourself. Not because someone tortured you, but because the place itself did the torturing. And worst of all, this was normal. This was standard. This was justice. So, you've made peace with the rats. You've accepted that your bed is a damp rock and your roommate might be a corpse with a name. What's next? Well, now you get to starve. Because in the medieval dungeon, food wasn't guaranteed. There was no meal plan, no daily ration, no guard pushing a tray through the bars twice a day like in the movies. If you ate anything at all, it was for one simple reason. Someone on the outside brought it to you. And that came with some big problems. First, they had to know you were there. Remember, arrests weren't always documented. You didn't get a receipt when they dragged you off the street. Your friends might think you skipped town. Your family might assume you were sleeping off an ale-fueled bender. Days could pass before anyone realized you were missing, if they ever did. Second, they had to be allowed to visit. Some jails were public enough for visitors. Others, not so much. Especially if your arrest was unofficial, or your cell was more of a hole beneath the courthouse that everyone pretended didn't exist. Third, they had to have food to give. And this was the Middle Ages. People were poor. Bread wasn't cheap. If your cousin had to choose between feeding their child or sneaking you a crust of rye, well, sorry. So what did that mean? It meant hunger became a punishment all on its own. No trial, no sentence. Just a slow, gnawing emptiness that started in your stomach and crept into your brain. Some guards might toss you scraps, a bone, a mouldy root, the part of the stew that nobody else wanted. Not out of kindness, just enough to keep you alive and cooperative. Because a starving prisoner confesses faster. And sometimes, food was weaponized. You might be promised a loaf of bread for a confession, or denied water until you remembered what they wanted you to say. It wasn't unusual for prisoners to die before any official hearing. Not from torture, not from disease. Just from being forgotten, starving in a pit while the world above kept moving. So, if you ever ended up in a medieval dungeon, your best hope wasn't a lawyer. It was a friend with extra bread, a good memory, and the courage to ask uncomfortable questions at the castle gates. Because in this justice system, survival wasn't about guilt or innocence. It was about being missed. So let's say you survived the dungeon. You didn't die of starvation. You didn't confess to stealing a bishop's goat. You didn't get forgotten under a pile of straw in despair. Eventually, someone remembers there's a system in place. You're getting a trial. Sounds promising, right? Not really. Because in the Middle Ages, a trial wasn't about discovering the truth. It was about confirming what everyone already decided, especially if you were poor. Let's start with the basics. There were laws, yes, but most of them were written by and for people who owned things, land, titles, horses, entire towns. If you were a peasant, the law didn't protect you. It described you as property, as labor, as expendable. Now, imagine standing in front of a group of men, all dressed in fur and frowns, while someone reads your charges in Latin. You don't speak Latin, but that doesn't stop the trial from proceeding. You don't get a lawyer. You might not even be allowed to speak. If you are, it better be short, respectful, and non-threatening, because raising your voice could be considered contempt, or witchcraft, or both. And the judge? Often the same guy who signed the order to arrest you. Totally impartial. Witnesses? Optional. Evidence? Nice to have, but rumors work just as well. If a neighbor said you hexed their crops or looked too smug during Mass, well, that was enough. And don't forget the best part, trial by ordeal. If logic failed, they had tests. You might be tied up and thrown into a river. If you sank, you were innocent. If you floated, congratulations, you were a witch. Either way, you lost. Or you might be made to carry a red-hot iron bar for 9 steps. If your wounds healed cleanly after 3 days, God had judged you innocent. Spoiler, wounds rarely healed cleanly in the 1300s. But here's the real punchline. If you were rich, none of this applied. You could pay a fine, make a donation to the church, or send someone else to stand trial in your place. That's right, you could literally outsource your punishment. But if you were poor, you were the entertainment. You were the lesson. The trial wasn't a path to justice. It was a performance, and you were always cast as the villain. And when the show was over, well, they didn't throw roses. By now, you might be wondering, surely, at some point, Someone has to show proof I actually did something wrong, right? Ah, sweet, modern optimism. In the Middle Ages, you didn't need to be caught in the act. You just needed to be talked about. Because back then, rumor wasn't just gossip, it was legal currency. Let's say your neighbor doesn't like you. You stepped on their cabbage patch once, or maybe your rooster crows too early. They tell the town priest they saw you, mumbling strange words under the moonlight. Maybe you were praying, maybe you were sneezing. Doesn't matter, you've just been accused of witchcraft. Or maybe someone's child fell ill, because medieval hygiene was optional, and now they need someone to blame. You looked at the child funny last week. That's enough. Rumors spread fast. There were no newspapers, no internet, just mouths, and they were busy. And once something stuck to your name, it was nearly impossible to peel it off. Because repetition created belief. If 5 people said you cursed a cow, it didn't matter that you didn't even own a cow. You were now the cow curser. And here's the fun part. Rumors didn't need to make sense. Contradictions didn't matter. You could be accused of being a witch and a thief and a heretic all at once, even if none of those lined up. Logic was not a requirement. Fear was enough. And the courts? They ate it up. Because a good rumor meant the crowd was already convinced. And a convinced crowd didn't ask too many questions when the sentence was passed. Sometimes the proof was your reaction. If you got angry at the accusation, aha, look how defensive they are. If you stayed calm, look how cold and unnatural, surely guilty. Even silence was suspicious. You didn't deny it fast enough. You blinked wrong. You hesitated for half a second too long. Other times, your possessions were the problem. Own a strange-looking stone? Must be a cursed talisman. Own a book? Witch. Own 2 books? Dangerous intellectual. Possibly a spy. And let's not forget animals. Did your cat follow you around? That's not loyalty. That's a demon familiar. Even being left-handed was sketchy. Left-handedness was associated with the devil, because obviously, everything sinister starts with how you hold a spoon. So no, you didn't need to be guilty. You just needed someone bored, angry, or superstitious enough to talk. And once the talking started, you didn't need a defense. You needed a miracle. Let's imagine for a moment that your trial actually happened. The crowd booed, the judge frowned, and the rumors won. You're guilty. Now comes the part where punishment is decided. And in a fair world, that punishment would depend on the crime, right? Not in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, your punishment depended on one thing, your wallet. Let's say you were wealthy, a landowner, a minor noble. You probably weren't in the dungeon to begin with. But if, somehow, your bad decisions actually caught up with you, don't worry. You had options. Fine the court. Donate to the church. Gift a few goats to the magistrate's cousin. Maybe commission a new stained glass window for the local chapel, with your name subtly spelled into the halos. And just like that, justice was served. Not to you, of course, but to the system. Your punishment? A public apology, a small fee, and perhaps some light humiliation. Nothing a new tunic and a strong ale couldn't fix. But if you were poor? Oh, that was different. Because poor people couldn't pay. And if you couldn't pay, you had to prove your regret with your body. So you lost something. Maybe a hand. Maybe a finger. Maybe an ear, if someone was feeling merciful. Steal a loaf of bread? Lose a hand. Steal a chicken? Lose a hand. Annoy the wrong person and get accused of stealing? You guessed it, lose a hand. In some towns, they'd tie you to a post and brand your forehead. Sometimes it was a single letter, T for thief, H for heretic. Sometimes it was just whatever shape the iron happened to be that day. The idea was simple. If you couldn't pay with money, you'd pay with pain. And then, you'd walk back into the world, marked, maimed, and watched. Because that's the cruelest part. It didn't end with punishment. It followed you. People stared. Employers avoided you. Neighbors whispered. Children asked what you did to deserve it, and no one corrected them. You didn't just lose a hand. You lost your humanity. In public. And while the wealthy strolled away in clean clothes with their reputations intact, you became the example, the warning, the man with no fingers, the woman with the branded face. That wasn't justice. It was theatre. And you weren't the audience. You were the lesson. So, you've been sentenced. You didn't have the money to buy your way out, and the court decided it was time for consequences. But here's the thing. The punishment wasn't just for you. It was for everyone else watching. Because in the Middle Ages, justice wasn't quiet. It was loud, messy, dramatic. Justice was a show. And you? You were center stage. Let's start simple. The pillory. That wooden contraption with holes for your head and hands, stuck in the middle of the town square like some sad, living statue. People would walk by, point, laugh. Some threw food, some threw not food. You might be there for hours, maybe days. Rain, heat, boredom, shame, all soaking into your skin like punishment perfume. And if the pillory wasn't enough, there was the whipping post. You'd be tied up, shirt off, back bare. Then the lash came, slow, rhythmic, public. Each strike not just a wound, but a message. This is what happens when you break the rules and can't afford not to. Then we move to the more permanent options. Amputation. In front of a crowd, on a raised platform, with a blade that had probably seen too much and been cleaned too little. No anesthesia, just a strong man, a weak saw, and a town full of people pretending not to look, while absolutely looking. Sometimes they'd hang you, not just as a sentence, but as an event. The gallows would be built in the square. Merchants would set up booths. Children would climb on crates to get a better view. It was a festival, a very bloody, very final kind. But wait, we haven't even gotten to the worst part. Display. Because after the punishment came the reminder. Your severed hand might be nailed to a city gate. Your body might hang for days, or longer, creaking in the wind, dressed in flies. Sometimes they left a sign, a little wooden placard with your name and your crime. Thief, traitor, witch. Sometimes they didn't. Because honestly, by then, people got the message. And the message wasn't about guilt or justice or even the law. It was about control, fear, and the idea that the only thing worse than watching a punishment was starring in one. It worked too. People whispered. People obeyed. People kept their heads down, literally. So when they punished you, they didn't do it behind closed doors. They opened the doors. They built a stage. They invited the whole town. And when it was over, they left the setup. Just in case the crowd needed a sequel, let's say you got lucky. Or at least, lucky by medieval standards. You weren't executed. You weren't publicly maimed. You weren't turned into a cautionary tale hanging from the city gate. You were just waiting. Because someone, somewhere, decided you were worth a trial. Eventually, but here's the problem, eventually didn't have a date. In the Middle Ages, trials didn't happen on a schedule. There were no court clerks sending reminder scrolls. No one marked their calendars with Tuesday. Hang out with judge. You got tossed into a cell and told to wait. For how long? No one knew. Maybe a week, maybe a year, maybe forever. Because once you were in, time stopped, at least for everyone else. Out of sight, out of mind. And prisons, as we've mentioned, weren't exactly places built for long-term care. You sat in the same damp corner, day after day. Your cell didn't change, but your body did. Slower, weaker, thinner. You learned the exact number of cracks in the wall. You memorized the shape of your shadow in torchlight. You spoke less, thought less. Because what was the point? Some people went mad. Others simply faded. And here's the cruel twist. The longer you waited, the less likely you were to survive the trial. Not because of a sentence, but because of disease. Cells were crowded. Air didn't move. Water was questionable on a good day and actively deadly on a bad one. Fevers spread like whispers. Wounds didn't heal. They festered. You shared your space with the sick, the dying, and the already dead. Sometimes they didn't even remove the bodies quickly. There wasn't always someone assigned to check. So yes, you could spend a night locked in with someone who wasn't breathing, and no one would notice but you. And food? Still optional. If no one brought anything, you starved quietly. Even if you survived physically, something inside you didn't. You came in as a person. You waited long enough. You left as a shadow. And when, if, your trial finally came, you weren't the same. You couldn't speak clearly. You couldn't explain what happened. Sometimes, you couldn't even remember what you were accused of. But none of that mattered. You'd waited. You'd decayed. You'd proven, in their eyes, that you belonged there. Because in this system, waiting was part of the punishment. Time wasn't justice. It was a slow execution with no gallows. And when they opened the cell door, weeks or months or years later, you didn't run. You didn't shout. You just blinked at the light, took a step forward, and hoped they weren't here to lock it behind you again. Let's say you've survived the cell. You weren't executed, tortured, too much, or left to rot completely. You're still here. And that's the problem. Because in the Middle Ages, being alive too long in prison wasn't a sign of justice working. It was a sign that you were now a burden. You were taking up space, breathing precious air, possibly stinking up the dungeon with your continued existence. And if the court forgot about you, if your family stopped visiting, if your trial never came, what now? Simple. You could be sold. Not released. Not pardoned. Sold. Like surplus grain. Or a slightly damaged donkey. Because if the jailer couldn't justify keeping you, and no one wanted to deal with your case, you became a transferable asset. Sometimes they sold you to local lords, for labor. You'd be sent to work in fields, mines, or kitchens. No pay, no name, just a body that could lift things and eventually collapse. Sometimes you were sold to military recruiters, especially during times of war. Congratulations, you're now cannon fodder for a cause you don't understand, fighting for a king who doesn't know you exist. Other times, you were simply handed over to someone who made a donation. A noble family wants more workers? Great. They've got room in the stables. Guess who's going to shovel horse dung for the rest of their shortened life? And let's not forget the overseas market. Yes, depending on where you were, you could be shipped off, traded to foreign merchants, sent to distant colonies, disappearing from one jail cell and reappearing, in chains, on the other side of the known world. Did you get a say in this? Of course not. There were no contracts, no explanations. One day, a guard came in. He pointed. You stood up. And just like that, you were someone else's problem and property. They might brand you, change your name, or just refer to you as the quiet one from the dungeon. And if you thought prison was dehumanizing, wait until you try being inventory. You weren't even judged guilty. You were just inconvenient. And the system didn't waste inconveniences. It monetized them. Because to the people running things, prisoners weren't people. They were overstock. And the longer you lived, the more pressure there was to do something with you. Not for justice, not for rehabilitation, but for profit. So, if you ever found yourself in a medieval jail, remember, you weren't just at risk of death. You were at risk of being sold, quietly, permanently, and without a goodbye. Not because you were dangerous, but because someone needed coin, and you were still breathing. Let's imagine the unthinkable happened. You survived the arrest. You endured the dungeon. You made it through the waiting, the sickness, the trial, the humiliation. And now, you're free. The door creaks open. You step out into the daylight. No shackles, no guards, no rats. You're a free person. But here's the thing no one told you. Freedom doesn't mean restoration. You don't get your name back. You don't get your dignity back. You don't even get your old clothes back. They were probably sold or burned 2 winters ago. Because in the medieval world, once you'd been to prison, that became your entire story. It didn't matter if you were innocent. It didn't matter if you were acquitted. It didn't even matter if the charges were nonsense to begin with, witchcraft by walking strangely, or theft of a missing turnip. You were now a person who had been in chains, and that followed you like a bad smell. You tried to return to your village. People stared, whispered, moved their children indoors. The blacksmith wouldn't meet your eye. The baker shorted your loaf by 2 fingers. You weren't home. You were a rumor made real. And employment? Forget it. No one wanted to hire a former prisoner. You were unpredictable, possibly cursed, probably contagious. You might bring misfortune, or fleas, or both. You told them you were innocent. They smiled and nodded, the way people do when they've already decided. If you had a family, they might welcome you, cautiously. If they still lived. If they hadn't sold the house to cover fines. If they weren't ashamed to be seen with you. Most former prisoners ended up wandering. No job, no roof, no coin. Some became beggars. Some returned to crime, not out of evil, but because you can only go hungry for so many nights before your conscience starts to loosen. Some simply disappeared. Into the woods, into another town, into oblivion. Because there were no support systems, no social reintegration programs. No one saying, "You've served your time, now let's help you rebuild." There was only this unspoken sentence. You may leave the prison, but you'll never leave the label. And the saddest part? You weren't even bitter. You were tired. Tired in a way that went deeper than bone. The kind of tired that made silence feel like shelter. So you kept your head down. You spoke less. You stopped telling your story, because no one wanted to hear it. You lived quietly, carefully, invisibly. You grew older. And when you finally died, maybe in a ditch, maybe in a stranger's barn, there was no one to write your name. No record. No stone. Just one less prisoner in a world that had no space for former ones. Because in the Middle Ages, getting out of prison didn't mean you were free. It just meant you were no longer in a cage. The world outside still had bars. They were just harder to see. So, after everything we've wandered through, the arrests without reason, the rumors as evidence, the torture chambers dressed up as prisons, and the trials that made 0 sense, the conclusion is pretty clear. You really, really didn't want to get arrested in the Middle Ages. Because it wasn't just about punishment. It wasn't even about guilt. It was about disappearing, slowly, painfully, and publicly. Once you were caught in the system, there was no version of events where you came out clean. You were either broken, forgotten, or repurposed. And even if you somehow stumbled your way to freedom, you didn't get your life back. You just got more time to carry the stain of what had happened. Justice wasn't blind. It was tired, moody, underfunded, and very easily swayed by money and mood swings. And for ordinary people, the ones without titles, coins, or family connections, surviving the law was more about luck than logic. So next time you read a romantic fantasy about running off to live in a medieval village, maybe reconsider. Stay in this century. It's deeply flawed, sure. But at least your neighbor can't legally accuse you of witchcraft because your cat stared at his goat. Thanks for sticking with me through this very cozy descent into historical horror. If you're still awake, well done. You're tougher than most medieval prisoners. And if you've drifted off by now, even better. You've earned your peace. Sleep well. And may no one ever knock on your door holding a torch and asking strange questions about a missing chicken. Good night. Before the invention of glass, before the polished bronze mirror, even before firelight cast a reflection in a still pool of water, humans were already grooming. They didn't need a perfect reflection to know that their hair had grown wild. They didn't need a looking glass to feel the itch of stubble, or the weight of dust clinging to their scalp. The desire to clean, to remove, to shape, that came before language, before history. It came before civilization had a name. In the earliest layers of human life, grooming was survival, removing parasites, smoothing the skin, plucking hair. A way to feel less itchy, less exposed, less vulnerable to infection or discomfort. But slowly, over thousands of years, it became more than that. It became ritual, and later, it became beauty. Archaeologists have uncovered sharp flakes of obsidian, volcanic glass, carefully chipped and shaped. They weren't tools for hunting. They weren't weapons. They were razors. Blades no wider than a fingernail, but sharp enough to slice through hair with surgical precision. Alongside them, seashells with smoothed edges, animal bones polished to a shine, primitive tweezers carved from wood. It's strange to think, the first tools ever used on the human body weren't made to heal it, they were made to groom it. Even without a mirror, people cared. Perhaps they didn't know what they looked like in the way we know today, but they knew what it meant to be presentable, to appear clean, to look ready for a hunt, a ritual, or a courtship. And so, around fires, in the shelter of caves, or by riverbanks, men and women shaped themselves, by touch, by habit, by memory. They did this without stainless steel, without barbershops, without shaving foam or soap. There was only stone, and bone, and skin. The hand was mirror enough. You could feel where hair had grown rough. You could feel where it needed to be scraped away. And they scraped it. Sometimes they used sharpened flint. Sometimes it was a shard of glassy rock. Sometimes it was nothing more than a hard shell, wedged between the fingers and drawn slowly across the cheek. The result was rarely perfect. There were cuts, nicks, sometimes blood. But they kept doing it. Why? Because to groom was to belong, to be accepted. In many ancient communities, body hair marked different things: age, status, ritual purity. A clean-shaven face might mean readiness for marriage, or adulthood, or war, or the first steps into spiritual life. It's easy to imagine a young man sitting in silence as an elder drags a chipped blade across his jaw. A ritual, not for beauty, but for becoming. The first cut, the first blood, the first time you leave childhood behind. And for women, grooming was no less powerful. Long before combs were carved from ivory or horn, they were woven from twigs. Hair was oiled with animal fat, smoothed with stones, braided, tied, burned. In some places, hair was considered dangerous, holding memories or magic. In others, it was sacred. To cut it was to change one's fate. But all across the ancient world, in caves and tents, on the edges of deserts and frozen tundras, people shaped their appearance without ever seeing the full result. There were no bathroom mirrors, no shiny chrome taps, no backlit selfies to check symmetry. They trusted touch, they trusted others, and they trusted the tradition passed down, not in words, but in movements. The scrape of stone, the pull of fingers, the hiss of hair drawn tight and cut. You might think of grooming today as vanity, a choice, an aesthetic detail, but for the first humans, it was instinct, it was identity. It was something you did not because you were seen, but because you were human. There's something oddly tender about that. To care for your body without seeing it, to shape it with tools made of rock and shell, to bleed a little and then press a cool leaf to the skin, because it's just what your father did, and his father before him. In that way, grooming isn't modern. It's ancient, older than mirrors by thousands of years. Because long before we could see ourselves, we already wanted to become someone. You wake up with a strange itch on your chin. It's not just discomfort, it's awareness. Something is growing, something uneven, something untamed. You reach up with your hand. The stubble catches at your fingertips like thorns from a sleeping bush. This is instinct. To remove, to smooth, to control what grows. And yet, is it only instinct? Animals groom themselves. They lick their fur, pick at ticks, rub their backs against trees. But they do not shave. They do not scrape away the hair from their faces using blades made of stone and fire. That is something only humans do. Which means, shaving might not just be instinct, it might be a message. A signal. In every corner of human history, the act of shaving has meant something. In some cultures, a clean face meant youth. In others, it meant purity. In some, a beard was a symbol of power, wisdom, and age. In others, it was a sign of disorder, sloppiness, or even rebellion. But shaving, especially when done deliberately, regularly, has often said this: I care what you think of me, because shaving takes effort. It requires tools, focus, risk, pain sometimes, and pain, willingly chosen, is never without meaning. It is ritual, it is symbol. When early humans began to shave, they were not just reacting to hair, they were crafting an appearance. They were marking themselves. sending quiet signals into the group around them. I am ready. I belong. I have passed the test. The ancient Egyptians shaved their heads and bodies completely, partly for hygiene, partly for status. Priests were shaved to demonstrate spiritual cleanliness, soldiers to show discipline. Pharaohs wore false beards, not because they grew them, but because the beard symbolized divine authority, a beard they could take off, put on, and reshape at will. In ancient Rome, a man's first shave marked his passage into adulthood. It was called the depositio barbae, the surrendering of the beard. The hair would be saved, sometimes offered to a god, sometimes kept by the family, like a baby tooth or a photograph. It meant something had changed. The boy had stepped forward. The man had arrived. In medieval Europe, knights were expected to be clean-shaven as a sign of honor and self-control. In contrast, monks often shaved only the crown of their heads, leaving a circle of hair called a tonsure, a signal of humility, of obedience, of separation from worldly pride. And among certain indigenous groups, removing facial hair was done not with razors, but by plucking, each hair pulled by hand, over hours, not out of vanity, but as a sign of resilience, endurance, control over the body. These are not random actions. These are languages, not written in words, but carved in skin. In today's world, we often call shaving personal hygiene. But is it really so personal? Think of the job interview, the wedding day, the court date, the first date, the funeral. The mirror stares back. The razor comes out. You want to say something without saying it. That you are trying. That you are presentable. That you understand the unspoken rules. Shaving becomes a costume, a mask, a uniform, a way to enter spaces where the hair of your natural face might not be allowed. Of course, not everyone shaves, and that too says something. To keep the beard, to grow it wild, to trim it into shape. These are also social statements. A man with a perfectly trimmed goatee, a full bushy beard, a clean bare chin. They each speak, and we hear them, even when we pretend we don't. So what does it mean, really, when a person scrapes a blade across their face? Is it just grooming? Is it survival? Is it ancient habit? Or is it a quiet act of transformation? The answer is both. Shaving lies at the edge between instinct and identity. We do it because it feels natural, and also because we've learned that it matters, that it changes how we're seen, that it prepares us, ritually, for whatever is coming next. The sharp edge draws more than hair. It draws a line between yesterday and today, between wild and tamed, between who we were and who we hope to become. So next time you pick up a razor, pause, listen to what your body is saying and what your society might be whispering behind it. Because shaving is never just about the hair. It's about the story you're telling, without speaking at all. Imagine holding a razor made not of steel, but of stone. Not smooth, not ergonomic, not gleaming chrome with a rubber grip and lubricated strip, but jagged, sharp in a crude, irregular way, a shard of obsidian, a sliver of flint. Something that cuts not because it was forged, but because it broke in just the right way. This was your razor. Long before humans melted metal, they broke rocks. And sometimes, the sharpest pieces didn't go into spears or arrows. They went into hands, steady ones, that hovered just beneath the eye, just beside the jawline, a place where one wrong move could turn a morning ritual into a bloody mess. These weren't tools of war, but they looked like they could be. Some of the earliest known razor stones, discovered in burial sites and cave dwellings, were no larger than a thumb, but they were shaped intentionally, edges ground just enough, surfaces polished by fingers over time. Some were wrapped with twine or animal hide, handles for control, for grip, for care. They look like weapons, but they aren't. Not quite. Or perhaps they are, just not for killing. Because a blade can be used to defend or to define, and a razor, primitive, dangerous, unrefined, is a kind of weapon. Not against others, but against chaos. Against the wilderness of your own face. To shave with stone was to tame yourself. Every stroke was a gamble. The blade might catch, might drag, might tear. Skin was thinner back then, Not biologically, but socially. No antibiotics, no band-aids. A deep cut could fester. A swollen cheek could become deadly. And yet, they still did it. Because it mattered. Some anthropologists believe that shaving with stone was one of the earliest signs of controlled pain, the kind we choose, for reasons beyond necessity, like tattoos, like piercings, like rituals. You bleed because you belong. It's not hard to imagine someone sitting by firelight, sharpening a small sliver of flint against another rock, not for hunting, not for carving meat, but for the mourning, for the mirrorless ritual of scraping hair from flesh. Sometimes they added bone, small handles carved from deer ribs or bird legs, sometimes even shells, razor clam shells, shaped into curves that fit the chin. Some were found worn down at the edge, as if used again and again. These weren't one-time tools. They were personal, daily, intimate. And they looked like knives. Knives for the face. You can almost hear the sound they made. Not the gentle swish of a modern razor on foam, but something rougher, grainier, a scraping, grating rhythm, like bark being peeled from wood, a sound closer to survival than self-care. But perhaps, for early humans, the line between the two didn't exist. To survive was to care for the self, to groom, to clean, to prepare the body, not just for others, but for the environment, the group, the gods. A clean face could be part of a ritual, a prayer, a transformation. A single stone shard might live beside you for years, hidden in a pouch, wrapped in cloth, stained with rust-red flecks, a blade that remembered your face better than you did. It was dangerous. But then again, most important things are, beauty has always flirted with harm. We pull hair, we pierce ears, we smooth skin with fire, acid, stone. Even today, we chase sharpness, precision, at the edge of risk. We trust razors close to the throat. We squeeze blackheads. We laser flesh. The instinct hasn't changed. Only the materials have. So when you imagine the first razors, don't think of shiny silver in bathroom light. Think of rocks that looked like weapons. Think of a face lit only by fire. Think of a hand, steady in the silence, dragging a blade across skin with no mirror to check for blood. That's where shaving began. In the flicker of danger, in the hands of someone who had no way of knowing if it would hurt, but did it anyway. Because taming the face, even then, felt like taming something deeper. It wasn't smooth. It never was. The blade, if you could call it that, was little more than chipped stone, the edge uneven, the handle primitive or non-existent. Your grip had to be careful. Too loose, and you'd drop it. Too tight, and the pressure would drive it too deep. The first drag across the skin wasn't gentle. It caught. It skipped over the surface like a stone skimming water, only instead of gliding, it tugged at the hair, lifted it by the root, and tore it loose. Sometimes it cut, sometimes it scraped, and sometimes it opened the skin. There was blood, tiny lines at first, red beads collecting like dew along the jaw, along the chin, beneath the lip, a thin stream trailing down the neck. The kind of bleeding that stings, not because it's dangerous, but because it's humiliating, because you tried to be precise, because you hoped to be clean. But pain was part of the process. And they knew that. The people who shaved with stone, bone, or shell weren't surprised when it hurt. They expected it. They prepared for it. In some cultures, the presence of blood wasn't a mistake. It was a sign of discipline, endurance, willingness, a kind of sacred offering from the skin. Imagine a young man, barely into adulthood, sitting on a flat rock at sunrise. The air is cold. He holds a piece of obsidian in his hand. It's sharper than anything in the village, but it's not soft, not forgiving. He has no mirror, only touch. He draws the edge across his cheek and feels it split the hair and the skin beneath. A thin line of warmth follows. He flinches, but he doesn't stop, because this is what is done, because his father did it, and his grandfather, because to show up at the communal fire unshaven would mean something. It might mean laziness, it might mean defiance, it might mean shame. And so, they kept shaving, even when it stung, even when the skin was already raw from the day before. even when the water was cold and the wind was cruel, and the blade wasn't quite sharp enough. They found ways to soothe it, pressing cool leaves against the cuts, smearing ash into the wound to stop the bleeding, breathing slowly, waiting for the pulse of pain to quiet, then beginning again. It wasn't vanity, it was identity. Shaving, even in pain, said, "I am part of this. I belong, I obey, I endure." In some societies, communal grooming was part of ritual life. Men shaved one another's faces before ceremonies. Young boys were introduced to the blade, not in privacy, but in public, under the eye of elders. And each drop of blood became part of a memory, a test passed, a threshold crossed. In other places, women too participated in these rites, not always with stone razors, but with sharp threads, pulled tightly against the skin. Hair was removed from the body in strands, in tufts, in handfuls. The sensation was no less sharp, the symbolism no less powerful. To endure discomfort in the name of beauty, or belonging, or belief, that was the point. And strangely, even in the face of pain there was peace. Because repetition creates rhythm, and rhythm becomes ritual, and ritual becomes meaning. Over time, the sting faded. The motion became familiar, the hand steadier, the cuts fewer, and what was once an act of raw discomfort became something quieter, a moment between body and blade, between human and habit. Even now, in modern bathrooms, with 5-blade razors and soothing foam, the echo of those early mornings remains. The slight nick at the corner of the mouth, the red patch under the jaw, the reflexive wince. The pain hasn't vanished. It's just been polished. And yet, we still shave. Not because we enjoy the sting, but because we understand it. It wasn't just men. In the early mornings of ancient villages, before the fires were stoked and the sun rose over clay rooftops, women too reached for stone. Not to build, not to hunt, not to defend, but to groom. We often imagine early grooming as a male concern, soldiers preparing for war, priests shaving for purity, boys becoming men through the blood of their first shave. But women, long before mirrors and makeup, also shaped themselves, quietly, carefully, with the same materials, bone, shell, and stone. Beauty, for them, was not luxury. It was identity. Even in prehistoric communities, women were found buried with combs carved from wood or horn, their hair pinned with ivory sticks, their bodies adorned with beads, painted with clay-based pigments, and yes, their grooming tools placed beside them like sacred objects. Archaeologists have uncovered primitive tweezers, made of wood, of copper, even of animal sinew, tools to pluck stray hairs, to shape eyebrows, to smooth the skin. In some sites, curved shells and sharp stones were found near what appear to be hearths or communal bathing areas. The assumption is clear. These were not weapons. They were implements of care. Imagine a woman, sitting on flat stone in the early light, a girl braiding her hair, another gently scraping a stone across her legs, or arms, or under her chin. The gestures are slow, repeated, familiar. There is no soap, no perfume, no mirror, only memory. The memory of how it should feel, not how it should look. Because that's how it worked back then. Grooming was not about symmetry, not about reflection. It was about ritual, sensation, and tradition passed from one hand to another. They worked by feel, by habit, by the soft feedback of skin against stone. Pain was not foreign to them. Just as the men who shaved their faces bled into cloth, the women who plucked, scraped, and pressed hot stones against their flesh also endured discomfort. There was no wax strip, no safety razor, but there was intention. Removing body hair wasn't just aesthetic, it was cultural. In many early societies, a woman's readiness for marriage, fertility, or ritual status was tied to her appearance. Smoothness of skin, cleanliness of hair, the absence of wildness. In Egypt, elite women removed all body hair, head to toe. They used early sugar pastes, pumice stones, and sharpened bronze. But in poorer villages, where metals were rare, stone remained the old faithful. Obsidian, flint, shell. Sometimes these were passed down, mother to daughter, wrapped in cloth, smoothed with use, named even. They weren't disposable, they were precious. But it wasn't only about appearance. There is evidence that grooming served deeper roles: psychological, social, even spiritual. In some tribal cultures, the act of grooming between women built bonds, two sisters seated together, a grandmother scraping bark against her granddaughter's calf, not just to remove hair, but to pass on knowledge, intimacy, patience. Grooming became a shared language, a silent kind of teaching, a time when nothing needed to be said, but everything was felt. Some grooming tools discovered in burial sites show signs of decoration, not just functional blades, but carved handles, painted shells, tiny beads embedded in the grip. These weren't hidden items. They were displayed, cherished, sometimes even worn as pendants, part tool, part ornament. That's how close grooming was to identity. And while many rituals were personal, some were communal, before weddings, before births, before joining a new household. Women would gather, not in salons, but in circles, open-air spaces or enclosed rooms, perfumed with herbs and warmed by fire. Skin was smoothed, hair braided, bodies marked with ochre or soot. Beauty was built together. It wasn't perfection they sought. It was readiness. To be seen, to belong, to transform. The stones they used might seem crude now, blunt, primitive, but in their hands they became instruments of connection and expression. Even today, in some regions of the world, these traditions live on. Hair removed by threading, skin smoothed by sugaring, tweezers passed down from mother to daughter. The motions changed only slightly. The purpose, never. Because to shape the body is to shape the self. And to do it with pain, with precision, with care, that is not a masculine trait, nor a feminine one. It is a human one. Stone does not care who holds it, only that it is used with intention. And for thousands of years, women did just that. Today, it is filtered, smoothed, curated, cropped. There are apps to lift your cheekbones, soften your jawline, brighten your eyes. There are mirrors that light up and whisper compliments. Razors with 5 blades, creams for every pore, serums for every season. But once upon a time, beauty was none of these things. It was raw. It was unfiltered, untouched, unhidden. It was stone pressed to skin. A shard of obsidian dragged slowly across a cheek, a piece of shell scraping hair from a forearm, a strand of fibre, twisted and pulled tight, plucking eyebrows one thread at a time. No mirror, no precision, only touch, only feeling. And yet, it was beautiful. Not in the way we define it now, but in a different, deeper way. The beauty of effort, of ritual, of meaning. There's something captivating about the idea of ancient grooming, not despite its roughness, but because of it. Because it reminds us that beauty was never about ease. It was about choice, about intention, about standing still in the face of pain and saying, "Yes, I will shape myself, even when it hurts, even when no one is watching." There's a kind of purity in that, in the slowness, in the imprecision, in the way early people didn't edit their faces, they explored them, learned them, by feel, by memory. A scar was not erased, a mark was not concealed. It became part of the story. The untamed wasn't something to be feared. It was something to be honored. When we imagine someone grooming with stone, we think of danger, risk, bleeding. But there's something else too, something quiet, intimate, almost sacred. Because when you hold a stone to your face, there is no distraction. No background music, no scrolling feed, no timer rushing you forward. Only your hand, your breath, your skin. You must move carefully, slowly, respectfully, not because the stone is fragile, but because you are. This relationship between human and tool, between flesh and blade, was not clinical. It was spiritual, personal, an act of faith even. That with time and repetition, something could be made smoother, lighter, better, even if no one else saw it. Today, we chase perfection, but perfection is sterile. It has no texture. It does not remember us. But stone remembers. It wears down where the thumb always rests. It warms in your hand, like it knows the shape of your grip. It holds the tiny grooves of 100 mornings, of silent rituals, of half-finished prayers. And in that erosion is beauty. Not the beauty of magazines, the beauty of living things. Imperfect, earned, unrehearsed. There's a quiet confidence in the primitive, in the way it asks you to trust your senses, to find balance without symmetry, to see with your hands instead of your eyes. It doesn't promise flawlessness, but it offers truth. The truth of skin with texture, of bodies that bruise and heal and carry their history like a tattoo. The truth that beauty isn't what we project, it's what we commit to, what we repeat, what we choose again and again, even when no one claps. That's what primitive grooming was. A choice. To become, without artifice, without illusion, without convenience. And perhaps that's why, even now, there is something irresistible about it. About the image of someone crouched by a stream, stone in hand, water rippling, wind moving their hair as they press the edge to their skin. Not for fashion, not for applause, just because it matters. To them, to be made, to be marked, to be known by their own hands. In that moment, beauty is not something you achieve. It's something you remember. Something buried deep beneath the layers of polish and packaging. Something wild, something aching, something utterly, heartbreakingly human. The kind of beauty that cannot be manufactured, only revealed. Stone against skin, pain against purpose. The primitive, not as the past, but as the pulse that still beats beneath everything we call modern. We've travelled far, from the first sharp stones held in trembling hands, to the sleek, engineered razors resting quietly on bathroom counters. From firelit rituals beneath ancient skies, to quick morning shaves beneath flickering LED lights. And yet, the motion remains the same. Blade to skin, gesture to memory, the old rhythm repeating itself in modern silence. You might not think of shaving as history. You might not think of it as meaning, or ritual, or identity, but it is. It always was. Beneath the sound of running water and the hum of electric razors lies a deeper story, one that reaches back thousands of years. It's the story of people trying to shape themselves, trying to become something slightly more refined, slightly more intentional, slightly more ready to face the world. Not through perfection, but through effort. Not through tools, but through presence. Each stroke of the blade, stone or steel, is a small act of care, a moment of return, a reminder that even the simplest gestures can carry the weight of memory, culture, and transformation. Yes, we've gone from stone blades to five-blade razors, from bleeding cheeks to hypoallergenic foam, from shared rituals to solitary mirrors. But the essence hasn't changed. We still wake up. We still look at ourselves. We still choose, quietly, to begin again. Maybe that's why shaving still matters. Not because of what it removes, but because of what it reveals. The willingness to see yourself, to touch the untamed edges, to shape them, not to hide who you are, but to remember who you've always been. So the next time your hand reaches for the blade, pause. Let the history hum beneath your fingers. Let the silence fill the room. It began with a rock. Not a tool at first, just a broken edge of flint, sharp enough to draw blood. Someone held it to their skin, perhaps out of curiosity, or discomfort, or ritual, and saw hair fall away. A scrape, a cut, a change. And so it started. A conversation between human and blade that has lasted thousands of years. That stone, crude and unbalanced, became the ancestor of every razor that followed. Each generation refined it, shaped it, reimagined it, from one edge to two, then three, then five. From raw stone to forged bronze, to gleaming steel, to plastic handles molded by machines. From cold streams to climate-controlled bathrooms. From open wounds to soothing gel strips. We've come far. Or have we? Look at what we hold in our hands now. A sleek, ergonomic tool made of dozens of components. Steel blades spaced with surgical precision, moisture strips, pivoting heads, pressure sensors, heated handles that hum softly against the skin. They're impressive, beautiful even, but at their core, they are still doing the same thing, removing hair from skin, a task so old, it predates writing, predates wheels, predates cities. You press metal to face and drag, and in that moment, your body remembers the first time it happened. Of course, the experience has changed. Once, shaving meant risk. A missed stroke could mean infection, fever, a scar that never quite faded. Now, it's routine, a task between coffee and commute. We glide through it, barely thinking. But the tools have grown smarter. Today's razors come with vibration settings, built-in trimmers, even Bluetooth apps that track your strokes. The blades are thinner than paper, stronger than bone. Some razors have 5 blades stacked in perfect sequence, designed not just to cut, but to lift and slice each hair in a specific order, one for pulling, one for severing, one for smoothing, each one closer than the last. And yet, sometimes, closer doesn't feel better. Sometimes it feels like chasing something we can never quite reach, because comfort is not the same as meaning. Convenience is not the same as connection. That first stone blade, imperfect as it was, required your full attention. You had to move slowly. You had to breathe with it. You had to care. Each scrape was deliberate. Each pass, a negotiation. Now, we rush. We multitask. We forget. We forget that shaving was once something sacred, a preparation, a transformation, a ritual. We've made it efficient, but we've also made it invisible, private, disposable, quiet in a different way. The razors are better, but is the experience? Perhaps the answer depends on what you seek. If it's speed, precision, comfort, yes, we've succeeded. The modern razor is a marvel. It rarely cuts. It rarely pulls. It hums with certainty. But if what you seek is ritual, if what you seek is the feeling of becoming something else, then maybe the stone had something we lost. The rawness, the slowness, the sense that this act mattered, that it wasn't just about removing hair, but about becoming clean in a different way, ready in a deeper sense, not just externally, but within. You see, progress often travels in a circle. We invent to escape discomfort. And then, sometimes, we look back and long for the meaning that discomfort held. That first razor was made with hands. So was the second. And the third. Eventually, machines took over, then algorithms. But your hand still moves, still holds the blade, still draws it across your skin in the same direction as your ancestors did. Maybe that's the strange truth of it all. That despite the 5 blades, despite the chrome and the silicone grip and the vibration motors, we're still shaving with stone. It's just smaller now, sharper, shaped by time and pressure, pressed into new forms. But the edge is still the edge, and the gesture is still human. So, when you shave tomorrow, whether with a $10 cartridge or a centuries-old straight razor, remember this. You are continuing a conversation that began with a stone. And though the tools have changed, you, beneath it all, have not. It's never just about the blade. We talk about razors as if they hold the power, the shape, the sharpness, the number of edges. We compare brands, we test angles, we adjust lighting, but the tool is only half the ritual. The other half is you. And the mirror. To shave is to face yourself, quite literally. It begins with stillness. You stand in front of the glass. You look, not at a photo, not at a screen, but at your own face. Unfiltered, unstyled, uncorrected, just you. Skin. Hair, shadow, light, the lines that weren't there last year, the softness where there was once sharpness, the way your eyes settle when no one else is looking. And then, slowly, you raise the blade. It doesn't matter what kind. It could be a 5-blade cartridge with pivoting head and vibration mode. It could be a safety razor, weighty and silent. It could be a stone, smooth on one side, chipped on the other. Whatever it is, the blade doesn't do the work alone. You guide it. You make the decision where to begin, how much to take away, whether today is the day you clean everything or just shape the edge. These are small choices, but they are yours, and they are intimate. Because when you shave, you aren't just removing hair, you're revealing. Underneath the stubble is a version of you that hasn't been seen since yesterday, or last week, or longer. Each pass of the blade uncovers something: the jawline you almost forgot, the curve of your neck, the softness of your cheek, not because the razor reveals it, but because you allow it to. You give yourself permission to see, and to be seen. That's where the beauty lies. Not in the blade, not in the brand, but in the quiet bravery of showing up to yourself, day after day. In ancient times, this act was often communal. Fathers shaved sons, priests shaved novices, warriors shaved one another before battle. It was public, shared, watched. But today, for most, shaving is a private moment. You close the bathroom door, you turn the water on, the world goes quiet, and in that small space something almost sacred happens. You meet your own gaze. You check in, not with your schedule or your inbox or your notifications, but with your face, with your being. And perhaps, for a few seconds, you remember something. That no matter how the world sees you, messy, polished, strong, tired, you are the one holding the blade. You are the one choosing what to keep and what to let go. You are the one deciding how to return to the world today. That is power. Quiet power. Not the kind that shouts or flexes, but the kind that whispers, "I'm still here. I'm still becoming." Some days, the blade moves confidently, smooth, easy. Other days, the hand shakes. You hesitate. You cut yourself. Just a little. A red dot blooms, and you sigh. But even that, the nick, the sting, is part of it. Part of the reminder that you are alive, that you are imperfect, that you are still learning how to be gentle with yourself, and gentle with the face you greet in the glass. Because that's what this is. A greeting, a return, a ritual, not for others, not for applause, but for you. Even if no one else notices, even if you grow it back tomorrow, the moment still happened. You showed up. You saw yourself. You faced the things we usually avoid, the asymmetry, the tiredness, the tiny griefs etched into the skin, and you stayed. You didn't turn away. That is what makes it beautiful. Not the sharpness of the blade, not the smoothness of the result, but the courage it takes to meet your reflection and keep shaving anyway. So the next time you pick up the razor, whatever kind it is, pause, take a breath, let the mirror hold you, let the water run warm, let your hand remember the way. Because you are not just cleaning your face, you are practicing honesty. You are honoring the ancient art of becoming. And no matter how far tools evolve, that part, that brave, quiet act of facing yourself, will always be the sharpest edge we hold. We've travelled far, from the first sharp stones held in trembling hands, to the sleek, engineered razors resting quietly on bathroom counters. From firelit rituals beneath ancient skies, to quick morning shaves beneath flickering LED lights. And yet, the motion remains the same. Blade to skin, gesture to memory, the old rhythm repeating itself in modern silence. You might not think of shaving as history, you might not think of it as meaning, or ritual, or identity, but it is. It always was. Beneath the sound of running water and the hum of electric razors lies a deeper story, one that reaches back thousands of years. It's the story of people trying to shape themselves, trying to become something slightly more refined, slightly more intentional, slightly more ready to face the world. Not through perfection, but through effort. Not through tools, but through presence. Each stroke of the blade, stone or steel, is a small act of care, a moment of return, a reminder that even the simplest gestures can carry the weight of memory, culture, and transformation. Yes, we've gone from stone blades to five-blade razors, from bleeding cheeks to hypoallergenic foam, from shared rituals to solitary mirrors. But the essence hasn't changed. We still wake up. We still look at ourselves. We still choose, quietly, to begin again. Maybe that's why shaving still matters. Not because of what it removes, but because of what it reveals: the willingness to see yourself, to touch the untamed edges, to shape them, not to hide who you are, but to remember who you've always been. So the next time your hand reaches for the blade, pause. Let the history hum beneath your fingers. Let the silence fill the room. In the medieval world, winter wasn't just a season. It was a slow-moving, bone-deep test of survival. There was no central heating, no wool socks from a department store, no insulated walls. Just cold stone, damp straw, and hope. For the average peasant in 13th century Europe, the arrival of winter marked the beginning of a long and uncomfortable stretch of time where daylight was short, food was scarcer, and your toes probably went numb sometime around November, and they stayed numb until April, if you were lucky. Most homes were single-room huts, built from timber, wattle, and daub. The roof might be thatch, the floor was dirt. If the family was fortunate, there was a hearth in the centre, an open fire that served for both cooking and heating. The smoke often had nowhere to go, curling up into the rafters, blackening everything, clinging to clothes and lungs alike. Chimneys were a luxury. People shared thatch-roofed spaces with their animals, both for warmth and because there simply wasn't another place for them. The wind slipped through every crack. The walls, sometimes just coated in mud and straw, provided little insulation. Windows, if they existed at all, weren't glass but holes, covered with oiled cloth or animal bladder to stop the worst of the breeze. You wouldn't last a day. The cold didn't just sting, it starved. Winter wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Food stores began to run low. Most people lived off root vegetables, grains, and what they managed to preserve during the autumn. Meat was rare. If a pig had been slaughtered in November, the salted portions might stretch into January, but by March, you were down to cabbage, turnips, and wishful thinking. Malnutrition was common, so was scurvy, especially in places where citrus or fresh greens were non-existent for months. You might wake up in the middle of the night with your stomach groaning, not from cold, but from emptiness. Children, the elderly, and the already ill were the first to slip, quietly, in their sleep, or during long, still nights when the wind howled like a warning through the trees. And there were no doctors, no heated clinics. If you had a cough, you were told to pray. If your toes turned black, they were probably going to fall off. No one called it frostbite. They just knew that once your skin went white and stopped hurting, it probably meant you were losing it. Keeping warm, a constant job that never ended. There were no puffer jackets, no space heaters. Staying warm was about movement and layers, though both were hard to come by. Clothes were expensive. Most people only had a single outfit, maybe two, worn day and night. Wool was common, but it was scratchy and heavy. Undergarments, if you were lucky enough to have them, were linen and rarely washed in winter. Sleep meant curling up under coarse blankets, straw-stuffed mattresses, or even animal skins. Families often slept in one pile, not out of affection, but out of necessity. Infants slept beside goats. Grandparents huddled next to dogs. The fire burned low. Sparks hissed. Every breath steamed like smoke. You might think, I'll just stay indoors, but that wasn't always an option. There was still water to haul, animals to feed, wood to chop. Life didn't stop. Cold fingers still had to milk cows. Bare feet still pressed into snow-packed earth to collect eggs or pour slop for pigs. And if you didn't do it, no one else would. The poor had fire, the rich had stone, and cold floors. It's tempting to imagine that the nobility fared better. In some ways, they did. Their castles were sturdier, their blankets heavier, but stone doesn't hold heat. In fact, it sucked it out of the air. Bedrooms in castles were vast, draughty, and barely warmer than the outside air. Wealthy lords might have multiple tapestries on the walls to trap warmth, and fur-lined robes to insulate themselves from the chill. But even kings slept beside coals in braziers and curled their fingers around goblets of hot wine just to chase off the frost. Bathing in winter was not done. The water was freezing. The rooms were colder. Bathing was risky. You might get wet, and worse, stay wet. In that world, staying dry was often more important than being clean. Illness was always lurking in the cold corners. The cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it weakened the body. Respiratory illness flourished. Fevers spread. There were no antibiotics, no emergency room. If you got sick in December, you might still be coughing in March if you lived. Communal living made everything worse. Smoke irritated lungs, straw bedding carried pests, and warmth came from proximity, which meant sickness did too. A single winter cold in a cramped house could mean a household of coughs for weeks. Light was precious. Time felt stolen. In winter, the sun rose late and set early. Days were short, often grey and wet. Candles were expensive, so people lived much of the season in near darkness. Work was limited. Reading was rare. You learned to rely on sound, memory, and familiarity. Night lasted long, too long. It stretched. Time blurred. There was nothing to do but wait. For spring, for warmth, for colour to return to the world. Life became about enduring, not thriving. So, why you wouldn't last a day? Because you're used to central heating, to hot showers, to layering clothes from a wardrobe, to electric light, door insulation, tea kettles, and thermoses. You're used to socks that dry in 2 hours, to hot meals on demand, to blankets that don't itch, to air that doesn't smell like wet dog and smoke. The people of the medieval world weren't tougher by choice. They were tougher by necessity. They didn't survive because it was fun. They survived because they had no other option. You, on the other hand, would probably start complaining about the draft within 20 minutes. By hour 3, you'd be curled in a ball next to the goat, wondering if you'd made a terrible mistake. And by midnight, when the fire's just embers and your nose is numb and your stomach is howling, you'd understand what medieval winter really meant. Not romance, not nostalgia, but a long, cold night, and the hope that morning would come. Surviving the cold starts from within. When the cold sets in and there is no central heating, survival begins with your body. The warmth you generate is precious. Every breath, every heartbeat, every step, heat is life. And the goal is to conserve it. This part of the guide focuses on how to keep your body warm using knowledge, clothing, and smart choices, even without access to electricity or fuel. Layering, the art of dressing to survive. Wearing more clothes is obvious, but not all layers are created equal. To stay warm, layering must be strategic, not just bulky. Done properly, it traps heat, wicks moisture, and blocks wind, all critical functions in low temperatures. The 4 essential layers. Base layer, moisture management. This is the layer that touches your skin. Its job is to pull sweat away from your body. If sweat stays on your skin, it cools you down, which is dangerous in the cold. Choose materials like merino wool or synthetic fabrics. Never cotton, which traps moisture. Insulating layer, heat retention. This layer keeps your body heat in. Think of it as your heat bubble. Fleece, down, or wool sweaters work well. Multiple thinner layers can be more effective than one thick one, as they trap warm air between them. Middle layer, bulk warmth. An optional but useful layer to add warmth. Thick knit sweaters, padded vests, or thermal jackets go here. If you're indoors without heating, this may serve as your outermost layer. Outer layer, wind and water protection. Especially if you go outside or are in a drafty space. This layer blocks cold wind and prevents water or snow from soaking inner layers. Look for something windproof and water-resistant, like a rain jacket, even indoors near open windows. Key rule: stay dry, stay alive. Dryness is crucial. Even a little sweat can drop your temperature dangerously. If your socks get wet, change them immediately. Air dry damp clothes if possible. Avoid overdressing during physical activity. Add or remove layers based on activity level. Protecting vital zones. Heat, loss, hotspots. Most body heat escapes from specific areas. Protecting these makes a huge difference, even if the rest of your body is layered. Head. Up to 10% of heat is lost through your scalp. Wear a hat or wrap a scarf around your head, even indoors. Neck. A scarf or even a towel can make a surprising impact. Hands. If gloves are unavailable, use socks or wrap fabric. Keep fingers together to trap heat. Feet. Double up on dry, thick socks. Avoid tight shoes. Compression limits circulation. Lower back. The kidneys are sensitive to cold. Tuck shirts into pants to seal this area. Use what you have. Scarves, towels, bandanas, old sweaters. Fabric is flexible. In an emergency, warmth matters more than appearance. Harnessing your own body heat. The cheapest and most reliable source of heat is you. Your body is a slow-burning furnace. You just need to help it burn efficiently and retain what it creates. Sleeping smart without heat. Bundle together. Share body warmth. Sleeping next to another person or even a pet can significantly raise nighttime temperatures. Sleep low. Hot air rises. The floor may feel colder, but being near the ground helps trap warmth under blankets. Use layers of padding or rugs to block cold from below. Make a tent. Hang blankets to create a smaller, insulated zone inside a room. Heat from your body will warm the enclosed space more efficiently than the full room. Layered bedding. A wool blanket, topped with a heavier duvet or comforter, works better than one thick layer. Air trapped between them boosts insulation. Keep your head covered. Use a beanie or wrap while you sleep. A lot of heat escapes from an uncovered head. Everyday objects as warmth tools. You don't need high-tech gear to stay warm. With a bit of creativity, ordinary items become lifesavers. Hot water bottles. If you have access to warm water, fill bottles, jars, or even plastic soda containers and place them in bed 10-15 minutes before sleeping. Brick or stone warmers. Heat a brick or stone near a stove or candle, safely. Wrap in a cloth and place near your body or bed. Rice or bean bags. Microwavable bags hold heat well. Even without a microwave, a warm oven or fire can do the job. Tents indoors. Camping tents inside cold rooms work surprisingly well. Add blankets over the top for extra insulation. Be safe with any heat source. Never leave open flames unattended and ensure ventilation if burning anything indoors. Focus on one room. If you're in a house or apartment, don't try to heat everything. Focus your warmth efforts on one room. Close all doors and block any drafts from other rooms. Cover windows with blankets or plastic to reduce heat loss. Lay rugs or towels over cold floors. Gather your sleeping space, food, and activity into this one warm room. Movement as internal heating. Motion generates heat. In cold environments, it's dangerous to stay completely still for too long. Gentle movement, every 30-60 minutes, keeps blood flowing. Simple stretches, walking in place, light squats, or rolling shoulders help. Avoid sweating. Moderate your pace. The goal is warmth, not exhaustion. Even clenching your fists and releasing them, tapping your feet, or rotating your ankles can help circulation in extremities. Eating for warmth. Your metabolism is your furnace. What you eat affects how much heat you can create. Eat more calories. Cold weather demands more energy. Fatty foods like nuts, oils, seeds, and avocados help sustain body heat. Stay hydrated. Drink warm liquids when possible. Dehydration affects circulation and temperature control. Hot meals. Even a cup of soup or porridge can raise core temperature. If cooking is limited, dry foods with long shelf life, peanut butter, canned meats, dried fruits, are excellent. Avoid alcohol. It creates a false sense of warmth while causing actual heat loss through dilated blood vessels. Psychological warmth. The mind-body connection. Feeling warm is not just physical. Your mindset matters. Anxiety, fear, or hopelessness can make cold feel worse. Stay mentally engaged. Read, write, talk, or listen to stories. Keep your mind active and focused. Create routine. Simple habits give structure, even in uncertainty. Use light. If you have candles or flashlights, keep the space softly lit. Darkness deepens the psychological chill. Connection helps too. Talk to someone if you can. Warmth spreads more easily when shared. Final thoughts. Surviving winter without heating is a return to basic instincts. Layer, move, eat, protect, adapt. Your body is capable, even without technology, but it needs help. Small changes matter. A scarf, a second pair of socks, a sealed window crack. Each one helps tip the balance between surviving and suffering. This isn't just theory. Around the world, people live this every year. Some by choice, most by necessity. You can't control the weather, but you can control how your body responds to it. In the next section, we'll look at how to transform the space around you, insulating rooms, blocking drafts, and making cold houses habitable again. But for now, remember this. Warmth begins with you. Protect it like your life depends on it, because it just might. The medieval home, not designed for warmth. A typical peasant house was made of wood beams, wattle and daub, which is to say, woven sticks plastered with a mix of clay, mud, straw, and sometimes dung. It sounds like a bad idea. It was. But it was what they had. The roof was usually thatch, bundles of dried grass stacked in thick layers. When done right, it could insulate fairly well. When done poorly, it leaked, housed birds, and occasionally caught fire from stray sparks. Windows were rare. If they existed, they were tiny, sometimes just holes in the wall. Glass was precious and rare. Instead, people used oiled cloth or stretched animal bladder to keep out the wind. These materials blocked light, but not necessarily cold. There was no insulation in the walls, no vapor barriers, just layers of earth and hope. The wind crept in through gaps. The cold settled in the corners. And the floor, always the floor, was a silent thief of body heat, sealing the home, the first line of defense. To keep heat inside, people used fabric and instinct. They plugged door cracks with old rags, draped wool across doorways, stacked straw against the base of walls. Any hole, any draft, became the enemy. The door, usually wood, often warped, was kept shut with a bar or leather strap. There were no doorknobs, just hooks and latches. You didn't want to open it too often. Every time it swung out, warmth escaped like smoke. In some households, people slept in windowless inner corners, away from the wind. In longhouses, families built partitioned areas with fabric or wood to create tiny microclimates. Privacy wasn't the goal, heat was. Some people even constructed tent-like structures inside their homes. Curtains hung around beds, thick woolen cloth, supported by wooden frames, created a cocoon of sorts. One fire, one bed, many bodies, minimal heat loss. You wouldn't last a day. The hearth, not a modern fireplace. A central fire was the medieval version of central heating. It wasn't elegant. It was just a pit or raised hearth in the center of the room. Logs burned slowly. The smoke rose, often not straight up, and spread. Chimneys were rare. Instead, homes had a smoke hole in the roof or an open gable to let smoke escape. This worked poorly. As a result, most medieval homes were smoky inside all winter. Your eyes would burn. Your throat would sting. And yet, you'd be grateful. Smoke kept the bugs away, and the warmth, such as it was, made life bearable. If you stood near the fire, one side of your body burned while the other froze. If you moved away from it, the cold crept in like a tide. At night, the fire burned down to embers. People covered it with ashes to keep it smouldering. In the morning, they'd blow it back to life. No matches, no gas lighters. Just patience, skill, and soot-blackened hands. Furniture that fights the cold. Furniture was simple. A wooden bench, a low table, maybe a chest. If you were lucky, a bed with a straw mattress and a woolen coverlet. But every piece of furniture was positioned with heat conservation in mind. Beds were pushed into corners. Stools placed close to the hearth. Walls were lined with hay or dried reeds to reduce drafts. Rugs? Rare. But animal hides were sometimes laid down to provide a patch of warm flooring. And since warmth rose, lofts were used when possible. People, especially children, might sleep in rafters above the hearth, curled between sacks of grain and dried herbs. Small spaces equals big survival advantage. Bigger homes were colder. That's why peasants sometimes had an advantage over nobles. Their homes were smaller, fewer walls, fewer rooms, less space to heat. In larger manors and castles, entire wings went unused in winter. Lords and ladies consolidated their lives into one or two chambers, often sleeping and eating in the same room. Tapestries were hung not for beauty, but insulation. Thick drapery covered doors and windows. Fires burned in enormous stone hearths, but the heat often went straight up the chimney. Even castles were cold. They had walls, but not warmth. In peasant cottages, every member of the family, and sometimes their animals, crowded into one room. The cow gave off heat. The dog curled at your feet. You breathed warm air into your hands and pressed them into your armpits. Comfort wasn't the goal. Survival was. Heating hacks. Creative warmth with primitive tools. Medieval people were inventive. They had to be. Hot stones were placed in the fire, then wrapped in cloth and tucked into beds to preheat the straw. Clay pots filled with embers were carried from room to room, carefully balanced and watched. Warmed bricks were used as footrests. Boiled water in leather pouches could serve as makeshift hot water bottles, though leaks were catastrophic. People knew where heat was lost and how to slow it. Straw mats on floors, layered wool on walls, heavy cloaks draped over doorways. In wealthier homes, braziers, small metal pans with burning coals, were used in personal chambers, but they were dangerous. Left unattended, they caused fires. Used too long, they risked carbon monoxide poisoning. And yet, people used them anyway, because cold was worse. The warmth of animals, and the smell of them. Animals didn't just live outside, they shared the house. Goats, chickens, even cows slept in the same structure as people, not because people loved animals, but because animals gave off body heat. A cow can produce enough warmth to noticeably raise the temperature of a small room. The downside? The smell, the noise, the hygiene. But in winter, the calculation was simple. Better to stink and be alive than freeze in a clean silence. The bed as a fort of fabric and breath. Beds were often elevated platforms, wooden frames filled with straw or hay, maybe a sack of feathers if you were lucky. The more critical element wasn't the mattress, it was the curtain. A bed curtain trapped heat. Some people even built canopy beds with full curtains on all sides. You'd crawl in, breathe warmth into your blanket, and not come out unless you had to. Inside was musty, warm, a little damp, but survivable. People slept close. Children clung to parents. Siblings layered together. The body was the last furnace left. Blocking out the wind, with whatever you could find. Glass was expensive and rare. Most medieval homes had no windows at all, or very small ones. If there were openings, people used oiled parchment, animal hide stretched thin, heavy cloth soaked in beeswax, wooden shutters, simple boards on hinges. During storms or especially cold nights, people sealed their windows shut completely, plunging the house into darkness. And no, there was no insulation. Walls were patched with clay, but the cracks remained. Some families piled snow against the outer walls to insulate from wind. Yes, they insulated their homes with winter. The whole room was a coat you wore. In essence, your home was less like a modern apartment and more like a second skin. It wasn't warm, but it was warmer than outside. And you layered your world, room, bed, clothes, fire, just like you layered garments. You didn't try to heat the whole room. You heated yourself, and maybe your bed. Everything else, you let it stay cold. You still wouldn't last a day, because you wouldn't think to bring the goat inside, because your bed doesn't have a curtain, because you'd try to heat the whole room, because you'd forget to bank the fire with ash before sleeping, because you'd open the door too often, because you'd step barefoot on a dirt floor at 3 a.m., because you'd light a brazier, then fall asleep, and because you've never had to shiver quietly for 12 hours and call it a normal night. Surviving winter without heat wasn't romantic. It wasn't beautiful. It was practical, smoky, cramped, itchy, and exhausting. But they did it. And you, well, you'd last just long enough to wish you hadn't tried. Calories were currency. You may think of breakfast as coffee and toast. In the medieval world, breakfast was not a guaranteed concept. In some cultures, it was even discouraged. Eating too early in the day was seen as gluttonous. Most peasants began their morning with a thin broth or small piece of bread, if anything. Some skipped breakfast entirely, saving food for later when the body and mind were more awake, and the sun had crept higher. It wasn't a choice. It was necessity. There simply wasn't enough to go around. Lunch, called dinner back then, was the main meal, often eaten mid-morning or noon, and usually consisted of pottage, a stew of grains, vegetables, and the occasional bone. Dinner, what we'd now call supper, was lighter, maybe leftover pottage or porridge, sometimes cheese, if the cow had given milk, sometimes nothing. Your body, today, burns around 2,500 calories a day, just sitting around in winter. A medieval peasant burned much more, because they were always moving, always cold. And yet, they often ate less than 1,500. So yes, hunger was a companion. It sat with you, quietly, in the cold. You wouldn't last a day. Fat was gold, sugar was fantasy. Modern diets fear fat. Medieval people craved it. Why? Because fat meant warmth. It helped the body survive the cold, prolonged fasting, and sudden illness. They ate what they could. Animal fat, butter, if lucky, lard, and marrow from bones. Meat itself was rare, but when available, it was preserved in salt, smoked or dried, often tough, always salty. Sugar, as we know it, didn't exist for most people. Honey was a luxury. Most food tasted like what it was: boiled roots, old grains, stale bread, weak ale. And spices? Not unless you were wealthy. Most food was functional, not flavorful. You might survive one bowl of turnip stew, but after 3 days, you'd fantasize about ketchup. Warming from within, by whatever means possible. Certain foods were believed to be heating: garlic, onions, leeks, mustard seeds. These weren't just for flavor, they were medicinal, mythological, and warming. Some people drank warm ale or wine, mulled with herbs, if they could afford it. Not for luxury, but to stay alive. Fermented foods like sauerkraut were valuable, both as vitamin sources and for digestion, but they were harsh, sharp, and often unfiltered. There was no hot chocolate, no soup in cartons, no clean water from taps. If you wanted something hot, you had to boil it over a real fire, watch it simmer, pour it carefully, then drink it before it cooled. Which meant you needed time, wood, a pot, a cup, and enough fuel to keep the fire going. Every mug of warmth was a chain of effort. And still, people tried. The routine was the warmth. Movement mattered, but not all movement helped. Too much exertion, and your body sweated, which, in a world without dryers, meant you were now wet in a freezing room, and wet was deadly, so peasants learned to move deliberately. Short bursts of work, then rest. Layered clothing, removed gradually. Covered heads, always, because 10% of body heat escapes through the scalp. And hands? Kept near the fire, under arms, or wrapped in cloth. Mornings were for tasks that required light and energy: feeding animals, gathering wood, hauling water. Afternoons were for mending, spinning, preparing food. Evenings were for sitting close, still, quiet. People didn't exercise. They worked, and that was enough. Don't stay still too long. If you sat too long, you got cold. If you stood too long, your feet ached with chill. If you lay down too early, the night felt endless. So people balanced. They sat with hands in sleeves, rocked from side to side, shifted weight, kept small fires burning, even if it meant extra wood chopping earlier in the day. Movement was medicine. Stillness was surrender. And yet, sometimes, there was no choice. You couldn't always move. Not with illness, not with exhaustion. So people bundled, wrapped themselves in layers, huddled near coals, and hoped, drinking to survive. Water was risky. Cold, unboiled water carried disease. So people drank weak ale, diluted wine, herbal infusions. Anything hot was good, even if it tasted like hay and ash. People sipped slowly, carefully. There were no thermoses, no mugs with lids. The steam rose. Your breath fogged. Your hands cupped the warmth like prayer. And when the mug was empty, it meant the fire had to work again. Food preservation was survival. The medieval pantry wasn't a pantry. It was a combination of root cellar, hanging meats, pickling jars, and salt barrels. People dried apples, buried beets, packed cabbage in brine, salted beans, smoked fish, and they rationed, carefully, because winter lasted not weeks, but months. Every meal was mouth. Every mouthful meant less for later. Children were taught early, waste not, want not, even breadcrumbs were saved, even bones were boiled, twice. Feasts and fasts, the church's rhythm. The calendar imposed by religion created its own rhythm. Fasting days, no meat, were common. Lent was long. Advent restricted indulgence. So the idea of daily indulgent meals, a myth. Even during holidays, feasts were reserved for the rich. The poor might get extra bread, a bit of meat, a turnip carved fancy. But otherwise, routine ruled. Same stew, same porridge, same prayer, day after day. Sleep was short, cold, and cramped. Food affected sleep. So did light. So did noise, and the lack of it. People went to sleep early, not by choice, but because it was dark. Candles were expensive, fires dimmed. But they often woke in the middle of the night, what we now call first sleep and second sleep. Between them, time to think, pray, or quietly tend the fire. Sleep was layered like clothing: straw bed, linen sheet, wool blanket, animal skin, body heat. And if you dreamed of anything, it was probably food. You still wouldn't last a day, because you'd complain after the third bowl of barley porridge, because your stomach would reject cabbage on the third meal, because you'd forget to sip warm water, because you'd overexert, sweat, and freeze, because you'd try to stay still under a blanket and wonder why your toes hurt, because you wouldn't know what to eat, or when, or how much to save, because you'd skip breakfast and miss lunch and run out of light to make dinner. The medieval world didn't forgive poor rhythm. It demanded balance, habit, and endurance. The people didn't just survive cold. They survived routine. You don't stay warm just by layering clothes. You stay warm by living correctly. By eating enough, moving enough, resting enough, and sharing warmth. By treating each bite and each step as part of your survival. You wouldn't last a day, but they lasted lifetimes. You don't survive winter alone. Not then, not now. The cold didn't just freeze fingers, it crept into thoughts. In the medieval world, winter was more than physical discomfort. It was a mental trial. Days were short, nights were endless. Silence pressed on the chest like a weight. You needed food. You needed fire. But most of all, you needed two people. Because in the deepest cold, loneliness was lethal. The mind suffers before the body. Medieval winters weren't fast. They came slowly, then stayed. You couldn't outrun them. You could only wait. And waiting was dangerous. Imagine waking up and seeing nothing but grey sky. No colour, no birdsong, no green, just frost on the inside of your walls and breath in the air. You put on the same clothes, eat the same food, perform the same small tasks. Over time, monotony gnaws at the spirit. There were no therapists, no seasonal depression labels, but there were signs: silence, stillness, sudden outbursts, deep stares into firelight. People didn't speak of mental health, but they recognized when someone began to slip, and they responded the only way they knew how: together, talking to survive the silence. In the cold months, conversation became survival. It didn't have to be deep, it just had to exist. People told stories, some true, some exaggerated. Tales about saints, spirits, old kings, or cautionary frostbitten wanderers. They filled rooms with sound because silence was heavy. Around fires, voices rose. While mending tools or spinning wool, people spoke. Sometimes they just hummed. Noise meant life. No one talked alone forever, and no one survived long without talking at all. The risk of isolation. To be alone in medieval winter was more than sad. It was risky. If you fell while gathering wood, no one would find you until morning. If your fire went out, you'd freeze. If illness came, and no one heard the coughing, it could end without witness. So people stayed together. They lived in tight quarters, not because they enjoyed it, but because bodies and breath warmed rooms better than fires. You didn't choose solitude in winter. You fled from it. You wouldn't last a day. Faith was structure, not just belief. Religion shaped time. It gave winter form. There were fasts and feast days, saints' days, bells from chapels, masses that broke the silence. The church calendar acted like a clock, a reminder that time was still passing, even when everything else felt frozen. People knelt on cold floors and whispered prayers into the dark, not because they were always devout, but because prayer gave rhythm, and rhythm gave comfort. Faith wasn't warmth, but it was direction. And in the stillness of January, direction mattered. Sharing as a means of survival. The idea of community wasn't sentimental, it was mathematical. One family had onions, another had salt, a third had firewood. Alone, none of them would last. Together, they made stew. People traded food, labor, stories. A neighbor might repair your roof, and you might carry water for their grandmother, not out of charity, out of balance. Even warmth was shared. One hearth for many, one blanket across shoulders, one cow heating the room for all. Individualism didn't exist in winter. It couldn't. Living close, breathing together. Medieval homes were tight spaces. One room, maybe two, beds in corners, animals nearby, no personal space, no locked doors. But with that closeness came awareness. You knew who hadn't eaten, who was coughing, who was crying softly after dark. Mental health wasn't treated, but it was noticed. If someone stopped speaking, someone else made them tea. If someone grew angry for no reason, someone else handed them a task. You didn't need words, you needed presence. In warmth and in silence, someone sitting beside you mattered more than anything they said. Small acts meant everything. Affection wasn't always shown in words. It looked like adding wood to someone's fire, leaving a better piece of bread, fixing a ripped sleeve without being asked, covering someone's feet when they fell asleep. There were no grand gestures, just little choices that said, "I see you. I need you alive." Light in the dark, literally and otherwise. Candles were expensive, but people used them because darkness could become too much. A single candle in a room became more than light. It became proof that the day hadn't ended, that someone was still awake, that someone still hoped. People didn't speak of fear openly, but they lit candles more often when things were hard, when the weather howled, when food was low, when spirits dropped. You can't measure despair, but you can count candles. Purpose as protection. When the cold got worst, people gave each other something to do. Knead dough, patch a hole, check the hens, grind grain, wrap herbs, anything, because movement warmed the body, but purpose warmed the mind. To sit too long was dangerous, so even children were given chores. Even the elderly had something to monitor. If you had no task, you had no anchor, and in drifting minds, the cold found cracks. Even silence could be shared. Not every comfort came from conversation. Sometimes it came from existing in the same room. Two people stirring separate pots, one person knitting while another watches embers. A shared moment of stillness, not loneliness, because company can be quiet. In those silences, people remembered they were not alone. That mattered more than heat. Why you wouldn't last a day? Because you close the door and call it peace. Because you confuse solitude with strength. Because you wait until you're breaking to ask for help. Because you light candles for aesthetics, not hope. Because you think resilience comes from isolation. Because you'd rather suffer alone than feel awkward together. Because you've never needed someone just to make it to the morning. But they knew better. They knew that survival isn't built from independence. It's built from interdependence. That resilience is not a trait, it's a group project. And that in the longest winter, kindness is not optional. The final warmth was never the fire, it was each other. They survived winter not because they were stronger, but because they were together. You didn't fight the cold alone. You fought it with shared meals, shared rituals, shared silence. One fire, many hands, one fear, many hearts. You wouldn't last a day. Not because your clothes are wrong, but because your habits are, because you'd wait for someone to invite you, instead of just sitting down by the fire. And in the medieval world, sitting down next to someone wasn't just polite, It was how you lived to see spring. You wouldn't last a day, but that was never the point. The medieval world wasn't designed for you. Not your body, not your mind, not your comforts. It was a world of slow cold, of dark mornings, of homes without heat and nights without noise, of meals that filled the stomach but rarely the soul. A world where survival wasn't about ambition, it was about persistence. And still, they lived. They woke to frost on their blankets and breathed into their sleeves. They carried water in frozen buckets. They broke bread that had gone hard from the chill. They huddled close, not for love, but for warmth. And they waited, through weeks, through months, through the kind of winter that didn't end in a snowball fight, but in the quiet question, is everyone still alive? You wouldn't last a day, but not because you're weak, because you've never had to be that strong. It wasn't the fire that saved them. It was the repetition, the small acts, the boiling of the same soup again, the patching of the same hole in the roof, the daily checking of the embers. The way they knew when to move, when to rest, when to speak, when to just sit. Their winter was not a story of heroism. It was a story of adaptation and rhythm and surrender. They didn't fight the cold. They lived around it. And sometimes, under it. They didn't live alone. The ones who lasted were never alone. They leaned on each other, sat a day beside one another, slept in the same bed, ate from the same bowl. They knew who stirred in the night and who didn't. They knew who was coughing too hard, who hadn't eaten their full share. And they knew that to ignore those things wasn't just careless. It was fatal. They didn't name their compassion. They practiced it. Quietly, daily, automatically. What they had that you don't. You have central heat, instant food, electric light, but they had patience. You have privacy. They had presence. You have options. They had routines. And they understood something we've forgotten. Survival is not dramatic. It's ordinary. It is a sequence of decisions, repeated, even when you're tired, even when it's still dark outside. This isn't about them. It's about you. Because when you imagine the medieval winter, you imagine it like a movie. Foggy hills, stone walls, flickering torches. But they didn't see it that way. To them, it wasn't history. It was Tuesday. So this isn't a story about how they were tougher than you. It's a reminder that you are softer because you can be. And that's not failure. That's change. But sometimes, just sometimes, it's worth remembering the cost of warmth, and how much of it came not from fire, but from one another. The thread that brought them through. It wasn't fleece. It wasn't meat. It wasn't magic. It was a thread, a line of small things held together by shared breath and shared purpose. It was the mother waking early to stir the fire, the neighbour knocking to check the roof, the boy fetching water before the frost set in, the old man telling a story by candlelight, just to hear someone laugh. That was the thread, and that was the warmth. You wouldn't last a day, not because you couldn't, but because you've never had to. And maybe, just maybe, that's the biggest difference of all.